Hello and welcome. My name is Lauren Errington. I'm head of the English department here at Maynooth University. We're so pleased you can join us today to see the short life and blazing art of Sylvia Plath. If you don't yet have your own copy, you can order one at a discount from the Maynooth University bookshop via the link that's posted at the top of the chat box. Red Comet is described by the New York Times as nothing short of mesmerizing. It's been named a top 10 biography of the year by Barnes & Noble, a top 10 October pick by the Washington Post and the Christian Science Monitor, and a fall book to read by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, and USA Today, just to name a few. Its author, Heather Clark, is professor of contemporary poetry at the University of Huddersfield. She earned her bachelor's degree in English literature from Harvard University and her doctorate in English from Oxford University. Her awards include a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Fellowship, a Leon Levy Biography Fellowship at the City University of New York, and a visiting US Fellowship at the Eccles Center for American Studies, British Library. A former visiting scholar at the Oxford Center for Life Writing, she is also the author of The Grief of Influence, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, and The Ulster Renaissance, Poetry in Belfast, 1962 to 1972. Her work has appeared in publications including Harvard Review and the TLS, and she recently served as the scholarly consultant for the BBC documentary Sylvia Plath, Life Inside the Bell Jar. Heather's in conversation today with Amanda Golden, Associate Professor of English at the New York Institute of Technology. Amanda's book, Annotating Modernism, Marginalia and Pedagogy from Virginia Woolf to the Confessional Poets, was published by Routledge in May. She's currently editing the Bloomsbury Handbook to Sylvia Plath with Anita Hella and Maeve O'Brien, and she's edited This Business of Words, Reassessing Anne Sexton, as well as a cluster on feminist, modernist, digital humanities for feminist modernist studies. Amanda was recently elected Vice President of the International Virginia Woolf Society, where she'll serve until 2023. And she's published in Modernism, Modernity, Woolf Studies Annual, and The Space Between, Literature and Culture, 1914 to 1945. Heather and Amanda will converse for about 40 minutes, and we'll have 15 minutes for questions. You can post your questions in the chat box. Please join me in welcoming Heather and Amanda to Maynooth English.
Thank you, Lauren. I was so excited when you asked, as I remembered 10 years ago when meeting Heather, and 8 years ago when we were in Indiana at the Plath conference, where Heather told me, I'm going to do it. I'm going to give her the Hermione Lee treatment. You go. Like, I was so excited. finally.
My best. I don't know.
Finally, we get, the Hermione Lee size biography of Plath for comparison. Pretty close. And this is paperback, so it's smaller. You have to adjust.
Right.
And I'm also honored to be in Ireland via a Zoom, and a place that meant so much to Plath, and that Heather has so well treated it throughout her book. And I think one of the most beautiful parts of Heather's book is how you're able to see her literary influences accrue over time. So it's not just as if she read one book at one moment, but over the 1,000 pages, you're able to see how encounters and impressions build. And I think that one of the things that distinguishes this biography from all other Plath biographies is Heather's expertise as a poetry scholar, and particularly an Irish literature scholar. So I wanted to begin with Ireland and ask if you, Heather, could talk a little bit about the role of Ireland and your identity as an Irish scholar in shaping the development of this book.
Sure. Well, yeah, just before I start, thank you so much, Lauren, for inviting me to give this webinar with Amanda. And thank you, Amanda, as well, for agreeing to be the interlocutor and to Maynooth. Yeah, I have a strong connection with Ireland. I started coming to Ireland myself in college when I wrote for Let's Go travel guides every summer in Ireland. So I spent my college summers backpacking around Ireland. And actually the first time I read Sylvia Plath, the first time I remember Sylvia Plath making a big impression on me was in Ireland. I pulled her journals off the bookshelf at a youth hostel. I think I was on the Beara Peninsula. And just remember being really affected by the parts of her journals that I read. And I don't think I had read her much in college or high school. And in fact, I don't remember studying any women poets in great depth in college except for Emily Dickinson. So this was, kind of reading the journal of a woman writer. It really affected me, and reading about Plath's ambitions and her desires and her sort of unapologetic ambitions and desires. Yeah, that had a profound effect. And as I say, I was in Ireland when that happened. I ended up writing my senior thesis on James Joyce in college, and then I went on to study Northern Irish poetry in graduate school. And my first book is about poetry in Belfast in the 60s and 70s, and how these poets related to each other, and how they related to what was happening politically and that sort of thing. And so that, I guess, studying the Irish poets brought me to Ted Hughes in a way, because I was at Emory doing research in the archive, on Michael Longley and Derek Mahan and Seamus, and that's when the Ted Hughes papers came into Emory. So I remember sitting at the desk in the reading room at the Rose Library, and someone was pushing the boxes in on carts, and I just thought, oh my God, what's in that? And so because I knew the Hughes papers were coming into Emory, and I was sort of casting about for a next project, I had also taught a class on Sylvia Plath at Oxford that really affected me and made me want to write more about her. I was interested in how poets relate to each other. I was very interested in this notion of poetic influence and how it manifests itself. And Plath and Hughes's marriage fascinated me in a literary sense. And I was really curious about this intellectual partnership that had resulted in some of the greatest, collections of post-war poetry. So in that tangential way, Irish literature led me to Plath and Hughes. But I was very I always felt a strong connection with Sylvia Plath's own love of Irish literature, right? And her love of Yeats, and her not just love of Joyce, but her expertise. And I mean, I think Ulysses and Portrait of the Artist had a profound influence on her work. And I in the biography, I talk a lot about how I think Portrait of the Artist, she was almost using that as a template for the Bell Jar, but it's sort of an ironic and darker, more subversive play on some of Joyce's themes. So I think Irish literature played a big role in Sylvia Plath's own development. And of course, she went to Ireland. She and Ted Hughes went to Connemara in September of 1962. They stayed with Richard Murphy. They went out to Inishbofin, which I spent a summer working in a pub on Inishbofin. So I enjoyed writing that part of the book. I worked at Murray's pub. And I lived in Dublin for a year, went to Trinity. So I felt like I had this kinship with her in terms of her Irish connections and her love of Ireland and Irish literature. So
yeah, I thought it informed well the granularity of the book, especially at times where there are things that have been in plain sight that we haven't noticed all this time, like that the 3 epigraphs to Plath's college journal are all from Irish writers.
yes.
Well, you would have noticed that. They've been there all this time for 20 years. People have had access to them and not noticed that. Maybe even
there was a lot like that. Like, people kept asking me, what's new, what's new, what's new? And there is a lot of new material, but there's also like a part of my answer, which I know isn't very buzzy or maybe even satisfactory, was that, well, there's a lot in the archives that's been sitting there for 30 years, but just hasn't really had a chance to speak. maybe because previous biographers were limited in their page number, their page space or the time that they had, pre-internet, right? I mean, so there's a lot there that hasn't made its way into previous biographers, but it's in no way new, right? So
yeah, and some of the first interviews that were collected by Harriet Rosenstein feature in your accounts now. They were collected in the early 70s, so 50 years. That's right. Yeah, later, 50 years later, they are new, and it's partly because of technology. Well, technology in part because the media's led to the information that these materials existed.
yeah.
And then more recently, now that some of the materials were digitized, a lot of us have been listening to the interviews. I really sort of raced to read them when the paper materials were acquired, but the audio recordings are just outstanding because all these figures that for so long we've been reading in correspondence and we've had a sense of their account come to life in new ways. People that I had envisioned one way, their voice is very different, and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean the Rosenstein material, hats off to Harriet Rosenstein for her research prowess, because she interviewed scores of people who knew Sylvia Plath, including long interviews with Dr. Boischer, right, and Aurelia Plath, at a time when everyone's memory was still so fresh. And she tracked down lots of men who knew Otto Plath, right? And that was one of the things I really enjoyed going through the Rosenstein files, was reading these letters from friends of Otto Plath and just filling in some of these character details. I feel like he's such a black hole. There's not that much known about him. So, files like that really gave me, I think, a better sense of him. And also some of her Smith friends, we hadn't heard so much from them. And as I said, Dr. Boischer, these very long, in-depth interviews with her shed a lot of light on, I think, her Plath's medical treatment, and the interviews with Dr. Horter. It was just a treasure trove, really, of new material. So yeah, I mean, we benefit, I benefited from that. I wanted to wait until, that material was, I didn't know if my publisher would force me to, cut the page space and all of that. But as it turned out, I was able to include it.
I thought there was a lot too that you were able to include, partly because photography made it possible to have access to so much at a distance. So things like Mrs. Prouty's correspondence added throughout the arc of Plath's life. She was providing financial support and advice, and had alternate plans at certain points for things that we really hadn't known. And I thought that was a whole new thread in the story.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that, because I say toward the end of the book that she was this unsung hero in Plath's life. Maybe not so unsung. I mean, we know the role she played, but I was able to, again, just go into more detail about that, and just what a bulwark of support she was for Sylvia Plath. Emotional support, financial support. I feel like we owe her a lot, especially when Plath was in McLean, and Olive Prouty was someone who kept kind of nagging her doctors for better treatment. You should do this, you should be doing that. And she was really, a powerful advocate for Plath in that sense. So yeah, that was one of the, I think, the strands of the story that I was able to just build up a bit. And yes, you're absolutely right about photos, right? Taking, because I had two small children while I was writing this. My son was born, I think, about 2 years into it. So in previous projects, I would just camp out in the archives for a month or 2 months, whatever. But with two small children, that was difficult. So yes, being able to scan the material, to take those digital photos and then bring them back home and take the time to go through them carefully, to reflect, to be, to quote accurately, check quotes against original transcripts, that kind of thing. Yeah, that was really important.
How did you organize all these materials? Could you talk about some more about how you write?
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges for me at the start of this project was to write in an accessible way, and sort of, I've been trained as a scholar, and we're trained to write in a certain way, and I wanted more creative freedom. I'd already written 2 scholarly books that I had published with a university press, and I sort of thought, okay, I want a bit more creative freedom, and so that was a challenge, just keeping it serious and critical, and but also readable, right? It's a long book, and believe me, I understand that I was pushing the limits with a trade press for this book, and hopefully it wasn't professional suicide to publish a 1,000-page biography. And thank you to Knopf for not making me cut it in half. But one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was because Plath did not have a big, as you Hermione Lee, doorstopper, and I felt that she deserved one. I just felt like she was one of the most important writers of the 20th century, and it just seemed odd to me that she didn't have this kind of in-depth critical biography, when people like even Nora Joyce, has a big book, right, about her, and the St. Vincent Millay, and there are women writers, and they've got these nice long biographies, but Plath didn't. So that was sort of, again, one of my reasons. That was something that I argued to publishers that would be new and different. So yeah.
And like within that, how did you decide which poems? And I know at certain points there are certain poems, but I know Plath has over 500 total poems, and only a fraction, about 2 something, are published. Yeah. So one of the things I thought was most exciting about your book was the attention to the juvenilia. How did you decide? Like, where do you start? And I thought how you did it was wonderful, because reading it against, especially the narrative about I could not be hurt, in places where reading it against the diaries, which you're able to do the first time, partly because of technology, but it's also that reading against diaries gives a sense of Plath's early creative process in ways that don't also minimize the emotion in there, that I thought you drew out well, both the feminist elements of her early work, and also the fact that other, for lack of information partly, and partly for out of perspective, that some of her early work has been given short shrift in a way.
Yeah, there's so much in the archive that hasn't been published, so much of her juvenilia, and I basically had to make some really hard choices about the poems I was going to talk about. And again, you asked me before how I organized the information. This is one of the challenges, right? When you have Sylvia Plath left such a paper trail, right? As we know, and that's why the title of Janet Malcolm's wonderful book, The Silent Woman, is so ironic, because actually, I could almost write a book about every day of her life. I mean, even going back to Aurelia Plath's baby book, recording when Plath got her molars and what she was eating every day. I mean, so we've got this mass of details. Some biographers have too little information. I had too much. And so yeah, just distilling that and making these hard choices about what I would discuss, that was it. That was a huge challenge, and I hope I made good decisions. And oftentimes my editor would just say, okay, you got to cut this section, right? And I would, because I trusted her judgment, and And I think for the juvenilia, that did get cut down. Most of what was cut in the original, that first draft was from the first half of her life. But I still, like, I would defend the amount of time that I spent on the first half of her life, because tragically she lived a very short life. And I think that her childhood and her adolescence and her college years, they're really important part of her literary development, obviously emotional development too. But the question that I was always asking myself every day as I was writing this book was, how did Sylvia Plath become the writer that she became? And that was always sort of my central question that I would try to come back to when I was feeling really overwhelmed by the massive amounts of letters, unpublished manuscripts, contemporaries letters, and so her juvenilia, I think it shows you, right, how she became that writer. And we get to trace her development, and we get to see what she was interested in, and the writers who influenced her, right? A lot of modernists, especially Yeats and Eliot. And because I'm writing a cradle to grave biography, that I just didn't feel like that was a part that I could skip in any way. That was so important to me to talk about that literary development, even though maybe I put on my literary critical hat in that section, which it's a biography, I understand that, but again, I just thought it was essential. Yeah.
No, I thought well, I'm biased, but I thought the literary critical words were among the best. And there was one line about one of her earliest poems, which is at the Morgan Library in a notebook she made herself, The Snow, where you're like, and the early poet probably delighted in the perfect trochaic tetrameter here. And I was like, oh, this is great. Oh.
Exactly. Like, I was reading these early poems and I just thought to myself, she understood meter from 8 years old. She just had this intuitive sense of, of an iambic meter, trochaic meter. She was gifted in that sense. So that was important to me to highlight that, right? To bring attention to the fact that she was already writing with a very kind of poetic, lyrical, formalist, whatever you want to call it, with that ear, even as a young child. Yeah.
And we see how broad it becomes too when you quote from her high school materials with Wilbury Crockett and things like the anthology she created, where she included Amy Lowell, or she liked Amy Lowell, and she wrote that brilliant piece on patterns, and that she was including HD. People were not, HD was in one edition of Understanding Poetry, but she was not widely known, or as widely known as she was in her own time. There was sort of that suppression of women writers that Plath was, seeking them out, and we didn't know as much about that before.
Yeah, and that she wrote a paper, or maybe even a couple of papers, on Edith Sitwell.
Yeah.
And that was so interesting to me too, because then that gave me a greater sense of Sitwell's influence on Plath's work. And I know Marcia Bryant has written a great paper about that.
To put a plug in, she has a great new essay in our Bloomsbury companion that Heather is also in, and has some great material in. And of course, like, as soon as, now that we're in like the last third of it, sending everyone back to Heather's book. Great new stuff in here. If I could shift gears a little bit, I wanted to ask you sort of more about the scope of the biography and your impressions, like maybe now in the aftermath of it. Perhaps after it probably feels like there's still a big cloud mixed with the pandemic overhead. But one line I wanted to turn to Hermione Lee, and one line that struck me at the end was just a beautiful impression, and I wondered what you thought. So she's talking about like the distance she has from this whole experience and the impact of it. And she says about Woolf, I can allow myself to suppose that I am seeing something of what she saw. My view overlays with just touches hers. The view, in fact, seems to have been written by Virginia Woolf. The lighthouse beam strikes round, the waves break on the shore. That last bit's very Woolf, but I was wondering, I was wondering the idea of seeing something of what someone saw. I mean, I feel like that's a tension when you're writing her perspective, and you do so delicately, sort of thinking about what she may not have said at times, or how she may have felt at times, and how maybe your perspective has changed as a result, and how maybe she's written your view as well, going forward, or how you think of things now in the aftermath of the project.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and my God, what you just read, that what a way to is that the end of the Virginia Woolf biography? Is that the last sentence?
Yeah, that's the last sentence in her chapter called Biographers.
Sent shivers up my spine.
Yeah.
That's the last sentence of the dead, you know? That last sentence, the dead that just never fails to yeah, send shivers up the spine. But yeah, this is, again, it's something I had to negotiate throughout. Was you know, people have brought up the idea of method acting, almost like, oh, did you just immerse yourself in the time? Did you listen to 1950s music? Did you only read 1950s magazines? You know, stuff like that. And you know, yes and no. I was actually careful. I think I sort of knew the dangers of letting my own life become sort of subsumed by another's, and I tried to keep an authorial distance, and tried to always center Plath's voice. You know, with her letters were published in 2018, right? So I had a lot to work with that previous biographers didn't, and I was able, I think, I would always go back to what she said, right? And you know, her letters or her poems, and I do quote a lot because I wanted to center her voice. But yeah, and then also being careful not to always, not necessarily to judge her with a 2020 perspective. And one of the things I wanted for this book was to really treat Plath in her historical context, like really treat her in a moment in history. And so there's a lot of social history in the book, and a lot of literary history, actually. So I was fascinated by, you know, the literary cliques and scenes in London in the early 60s. I was fascinated by Boston in 1959 and her relationships with Robert Lowell and Anne Sexton. And so the context was, establishing that context was always important to me, and maybe how I was, at least how I tried to keep that, you know, authorial distance. Sometimes I couldn't, you know, sometimes I would get so angry. Like, I feel like I mean, another reason I wanted to write this biography was because I felt like she'd been pathologized in previous biographies, and I felt that she'd almost, in the media, not amongst scholars, but in the media, there was this perception of her as her name is synonymous with madness and tragedy, and that seemed unfair to me, and so I wanted to, again, bring her intellectual prowess to the fore of this biography, her brilliance. You know, she was so cerebral. So I wanted to kind of challenge those reductive cliches that I felt had surrounded Sylvia Plath, and kind of diminished her creative legacy. So that was another reason, you know, I went into the project, and I did, you know, I do show my anger, I think, at some points in the book, especially in the prologue, when I'm sort of justifying the need for a new book. And I quote Adlai Stevenson and his infamous 1955 Smith College commencement speech, where he tells them all that they should embrace the humble role of housewife, and just, you know, as a kind of way into that era, and the casual everyday sexism that Plath had to deal with, and what a fighter she was, really. I mean, to break those barriers in the ways that she did, and to kind of always be true to her literary vocation and to kind of come up against that and still keep fighting. I think she had an iron will. She had such determination. She was the most efficient and organized person on the planet. Right? And those were all things that, you know, I wanted to highlight all of those aspects of her personality, which I think sometimes got buried underneath the kind of witchy death goddess cliche, you know?
I know that you've spent time in, as well as Ireland, at Yaddo, in England. I know you teach near where Hughes grew up, and you spent time in Hughes's town where he was born. How did your sense of all these places shape your writing of those moments?
Yeah, I started out thinking that traveling to these places wouldn't be as important as they turned out to be. So I kind of started out just thinking, okay, well, my first priority is to go through everything in the archives, right? Is to, you know, make sure I read every single thing that she ever wrote, every letter. And which I did, but I really was transformed by traveling to these sites associated with Plath and Hughes. Seeing her flat at 23 Fitzroy Road, where the last flat Plath lived in, seeing the room where she wrote some of those last poems, seeing the view out of her study window, you know, that she would have looked through. That was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. Staying in Ted Hughes's house, childhood home in the village of Mytholmroyd in West Yorkshire. The University of Huddersfield had invited me to be a visiting professor there in the summer of 2017 and very generously put me up in this house. And I was able to bring my family over. So I was able to immerse myself in that gorgeous West Yorkshire landscape and meet people who had known Hughes and Plath and just, you know, get a better sense of that world. And as an American, that's a very foreign world, I think. You know, for me, I spent 4 years at Oxford, but Oxford's very different from the Calder Valley. So I needed help there. And again, being able to walk the moors, right? Walk that path out to Top Withens, out to Wuthering Heights, literally following in their footsteps, right? Walking those same paths. And that, again, was a really transformative experience for me. And those were the experiences that kept me going over the long haul, because I think you need those moments to recharge, right? If you're spending most of your time looking at the written word, right? And you need to get out of the archive. You need to get away from your computer and, you know, talk to the people who knew her, go to the places where she lived. And it just, like I said, it recharges your batteries a bit and inspires you to kind of go back. And at least it did for me. So yeah, I cannot recommend that kind of, that style of research enough. Yeah.
What were some of your favorite stories or moments from meeting the people that you interviewed?
You know, I sat outside of 18 Bloomsbury Street, which is the townhouse, 18 Rugby Street in Bloomsbury, which is the townhouse that Ted Hughes lived in for a while. Plath and Hughes spent their wedding night there. Peter O'Toole lived there at a certain point. Daniel Hughes, who was one of Ted Hughes's closest friends, we just sat on a wall across the street, and he spent 2 hours giving me this oral history of that townhouse, flat by flat. And you know, that was amazing. And meeting Plath, a lot of Plath Smith friends as well, who still live around New England and New York. And oh God, I'm just thinking of, for example, Louise Geisy White. She won the award for best girl student at Wellesley High. And she knew as soon as she won, and she told me about this story, like she knew when she won that award that Sylvia had really wanted that award, and she was so upset that she was the winner that she ran into the ladies' room to cry. And who did she find crying in the ladies' room but Sylvia, because she hadn't won the award, right? So these, you know, these little stories that I would hear, kind of small moments, but to me really effective moments. And just listening to the stories and spending time with these people who had known Plath and Hughes, I would say all of them were enormously proud to have known her, really quite generous, wanting to share what they knew, which it was different from reading the Rosenstein files, because some of the memories from the 1970s, the early 70s, I mean, some of the comments were quite nasty. So that was interesting, right? But seeing a lot of the Smith friends, I think saying Plath was selfish and, you know, this and that. And by the time I interviewed people, not necessarily the same people, but I didn't hear much of that. So there was, yeah, make of that what you will, but it was interesting.
No, it's interesting how the passing of time, because in the 70s things were so raw.
Yeah.
And all of the, you know, industry hadn't arisen yet either. So what's next for you?
So I am working on a book about the Boston years of Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Adrienne Rich, and Maxine Kumin for Knopf. And you know, I just sort of began that. That came out of the Boston chapter in my book. I found I had so much more to say about that period, and it was one of these instances where, you know, my editor just said, okay, we can't publish a 75-page chapter about Boston, however long it was. I don't think it was 75, but, you know, I went down the rabbit hole a bit with that chapter, and, you know, she's like, reel it in. So so I had all this material, and I put it in, you know, wrote a book proposal, and yeah, so that will be published with Knopf in, I don't know, 3 or 4 years or something like that.
There is so much more to do with that circle. I love that Hillary Holliday's biography is just reviewed in the Times on Adrienne Rich. And
review, yeah.
Yeah, it's such a renaissance moment right now for this circle of writers in Boston. Sort of there's a lot to be said about their influence today, but also their networking and their development then.
Yeah, and the whole notion of confessionalism I find very intriguing. And, you know, I think Plath was using that confessional voice in an ironic way, right? And I think a lot of recent scholarship has drawn our attention to the ways in which she played with confessionalism ironically. But I'm interested in exploring sort of the origins of all of this and how the term came to be used in the media and all of that. So yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a lot more to be done on that period in time, and Lowell as well, you know, Lowell's influence on all of this.
Yeah, I thought the information about M.L. Rosenthal in the Rosenstein papers was just outstanding. It's sort of like the exchange we've been wanting to see for all these years. And Plath, as you rightly say, was very delicate about how she handled it. She wasn't, she was sort of distancing herself, yet also enthusiastic and enlivened, and sort of asking really informed questions about, you know, how a writer puts themselves in a poem.
Yeah.
Really showing her training, but also her recent influences.
Yeah, that when I read that in the Rosenthal file, that, oh yes, I was at a dinner party with Sylvia Plath. We really discussed confessionalism. I was like, oh, are you kidding me? That was fine. Yeah. So now we actually have someone, you know, a memory of Plath discussing confessionalism with the man who coined the term. So, and she, as you know, she said, well, it has to transcend the personal and it has to be universal. So she was kind of, as you say, concerned with threading that needle. Yeah.
So maybe it's a good time to turn over to the questions. Thank you so much for chatting. It's been wonderful. This is from my friend and yours, Di Beto, who's also in the Bloomsbury Handbook. She asks if you could say a bit more about Ivan Boland's comment. This is no longer a poet being instructed by nature. This is a poet instructing nature.
Yes, Yvonne Boland, I feel like she's one of Plath's most important inheritors. You know, those poems in Boland's work, In Her Own Image, they're almost too Plathian, right? I almost feel like Boland had to outgrow Plath, and then when she gets to Night Feed, then I feel like she's assimilated Plath's influence, and Boland is on fire, right? Those poems in Night Feed are outstanding. But yeah, she's written critical essays on Plath as well, and that I found those essays to be really inspiring. You know, just this idea. I'm trying to remember the exact line. It really had quite an effect on me. It was something like Plath just talking about this idea that she changed the game in the sense that now you could write about your baby in the nursery, right? And not that was sublime too. This idea that what the Romantic poets had talked about as the sublime, you know, which was nature, really. Plath kind of shifted the goalposts and allowed for this more domestic world to fall under that umbrella. And, like, you know, watching a kettle boil, you know, could be sublime. And Boland is a poet who really makes the most of those moments, I think. But, you know, just the fact that Plath was writing a lot about her children and these, to use a Boland phrase, domestic interiors, I think you can really draw a line between Plath and Boland in that sense.
Thank you. This question is from a reader of Plath, and she says, what work would you recommend to a novice of Sylvia Plath?
To a novice? I guess I would start, well, I started with the journals, actually. But I know those are sort of that's a big book. But I felt I always like to get a sense of writers' lives, and so I really enjoyed starting with the journals. But otherwise, the Bell Jar and Ariel, you can't go wrong, really.
There's a question about the symbolism of the title.
The title. So for 7 years or so, the title of this book was The Light of the Mind. And I was really wedded to that title, but Knopf didn't think it was a great title for a trade biography. And so they
know.
It was a bit of an issue because I had written that line into various parts of the book, and, you know, because it was such an important line to me, and it was sort of a theme. And anyway, there was a lot of back and forth, and at the end of the day, my publisher really thought that the book needed a bolder title, and they thought my title was just far too subtle. So after some back and forth, we came up with this title, and at first, you know, it took me a little while to adjust to it, but now I really like it. And so I tended to kind of trust their judgments, and of course my editor's judgments about what to cut and in the book. I was really lucky to have Deb Garrison at Knopf as an editor. Oh, and sorry, the title comes from Stings.
Yes.
and we weren't going to put the poem at the beginning of the book. I remember people saying, "Oh, but everybody knows that line, you know, everybody." And I thought, well, not necessarily, because I got a lot of comments about Marvel superheroes and that kind of thing from from.
I didn't even think of that, but this is a whole new level.
Okay, let's put stings in the very beginning. And I also got a lot of comments about like, oh, it makes her sound like a communist writer, you know. But now I think it's very appropriate to the book, because there is this sense like I have a self to recover, right? And I hope part of what I did in this book, I wanted to write a book that was a richer, more accurate, and less pathological portrait of Plath than what existed. So the title, you know, this idea of having a self to recover, a queen, you know, all of those lines, they do play into what I hope is going on in the book. Although sometimes you need another person to see it, in the sense of my editor just saying, this is a better title. Right?
And one attendee has a question about Plath's spoken voice and how it changes. I noticed too that you commented at times when she sort of receded into her American accent, and this contributor was asking about the British accent and how it evolved over time, or what your take on her spoken voice over time was.
Yeah, a lot of her friends, her American friends, commented upon that, and when I interviewed them and said, I couldn't believe the way she sounded when I heard her on tape years later, like that she had developed this British accent. They were really shocked by that. And I think, you know, when you listen to some of the recordings, I can still hear Boston though in her voice. My parents are both from the Boston area. My father has a really thick Boston accent. My grandmother as well. So I hear Boston, the kind of flat R's and that kind of thing. So it's almost like sometimes I feel it's like a Kennedy cadence. I hear in some of the readings. But yeah, people said toward the end of her life, you know, that period where she was taking some different drugs, and you know, it was a very bad time for her, drugs as in antidepressants and that kind of thing, that she was slurring her words, and that she would lapse back into an American accent sort of at the end of her life. And then I think in that Poets in Partnership interview with Hughes, some of the times when she's arguing with him, to my ear, she sounds more American. It's like she loses the the sort of more genteel British accent. And I sort of posit in the book that this is also related to class.
No, it is, yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. And just, you know, this idea of having a British accent is, I mean, to an American, especially at that time, that was just sort of a way to embody class, and to maybe even transcend your own class origins a bit.
I thought your handling of Hughes in class was very delicate. I mean, it shows the result of all your work on Hughes, but it's sort of, at one point too, Plath is defending Hughes, and she says something, he has lunch with the Duke of Edinburgh. It was very nuanced, so that, you know, scholars and critics will be able to tease out all these layers to greater effect. Virginia Woolf actually said in her essay on biography, I believe, that it's the biographer's job to include everything, because you never know what people will need. I may be misremembering it, but it's sort of that capaciousness of the form, but then also the struggle of the form and its content. Someone asked a question too about the excitement of archives and how it made an impression upon you. I think especially too of seeing some of the early diaries and the images which you describe at times of what Plath drew, and some of those have been reproduced before in iRhymes. And I like that you included that drawing of Aurelia and one other of Plath's artworks that's less known, but sort of the experience of the archive visually or emotionally for you.
well, this is something you also know well, Amanda.
Oh yeah.
Archive fever grips you. Go. I just think if you, some people love working in archives, and if you're one of those people, you just keep going back. And I really took to that form of research. I just love being immersed in the contemporary evidence of the time. I love reading these 60-year-old letters, reading the manuscripts. You know, when I was younger, I always wanted to be an archaeologist, and I actually went on some archaeological digs, and you know, even up to my sophomore year in college, I was determined to be an archaeologist, and then realized I didn't quite have the math skills for this, and but I was loving my English classes, and so anyway, I think of archival research as this as being slightly related to a kind of archaeology, and sifting through these historical layers and making your own critical judgments, and I find that really exciting, working with all the primary documents. Yeah.
I think that's an image Plath harnesses well in the Colossus too, the sort of restorative piecework that one needs to do, and the fact that you'll never get it pieced together entirely, no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try and hear their voices. They will always be a different voice than the one that existed in the moment.
Yeah, in you know, her early poems, I feel like something almost have more in common with her later poems than some of her middle period, right? Some of these, what we call juvenilia, which I actually think are very good poems, you hear that aerial voice in some of them, and then it kind of goes underground, I think, a bit when she gets to Smith, and then it reappears. So so when I say archaeology, that's sort of what I mean, just going back and trying to retrace some of these developmental stages.
And I think with your work now, it's mobilized in a way. Like now these images are visible. Now more remote work can occur.
Yeah, I think biographers are really, you know, we've benefited from the age, right? You know, the ability to take digital photos, and it's a game changer. And yeah, those diaries are a great example, as you were saying before, of something that's been in the archive forever, but we haven't really seen much from these early adolescent diaries, but they're all there, right? You know, anyone can read them, and her calendars as well. Her calendars are just such a rich source.
She fills them so much. There's one very small diary that she wasn't keeping a journal at the moment. It's the one from when she was in London and Hughes, she was about to see Hughes again, and she was with Hughes in London. It's the time when she buys the tarot book, and she fills like each of the little boxes with an entire narrative, you know, as if it were a full page diary.
Yeah,
and it's just astounding.
Those are in some cases I found those more helpful, just in terms of what was going on day to day, than her journals, her actual journals, because those are so philosophical, and you know, they're beautiful, but if you really want to figure out what was going on a day-to-day basis, her calendars give you a lot of information.
Good. I think we have time for one more question if anyone wants to add. Oh, there's a new message. Good. It's from Chris. If I could just give a shout out, who's thanking Christina Zimbakova in Macedonia, who I met 20 years ago at the first, almost 20 years ago at the first Plath conference, and who has a new exhibition and has created work influenced by Plath, some of which involving, what's it called? Mold. So, and not just ordinary mold and fungus. She corrected me, fungi. Oh, not just ordinary fungus. It's a very special fungus. Anyway, she could talk more at length about that. So I'm just looking to see if we have any more questions. I know one Oh, one message. There's one question about translating, and it's about a particular word, so perhaps you could follow up more with this after. But she's making a translation of Three Women, and perhaps that itself is a feat worth thinking more about, because Three Women, I mean, the fact that Plath wrote a verse play is something people do not know, and you drew out so well the fact that she was dealing with such controversial subjects, miscarriage, childbirth, women's voices in general, for the radio nonetheless. So I mean, it was for the public.
Yeah, and those were such taboo subjects. And I mean, Parliament Hill Fields, about her miscarriage, she reads that on the BBC in 1961, and I just find that so brave, and I'm so inspired again by the barriers she broke and the kind of taboos that she was up against. But yes, I would definitely keep going with the translation for
Three Women Around the World. It's very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Heather and Amanda. You've been such great company, and you've treated us to such a thoughtful conversation. Congratulations, Heather, on this beautiful biography.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you to our audience for joining us. We have several exciting events coming up, including research seminars on Arabic and English multilingualism and on crisis texts about the US-Mexico border. We also have colleagues Dr. Rita Sacker and Dr. Dennis Condon in conversation with Gary Keane and Andrew McConnell on their acclaimed film Gaza, which was screened at Sundance last year. And we'll be hosting a reading by Philip Metras as part of the Poetry and Poetics series convened by Dr. Catherine Gander and Dr. Carl O'Hanlon. So to find out more, you can follow us on Eventbrite and on Twitter at Maynooth English. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.